The day he left me at the hospital with our baby, I learned something I didn't understand until 7 years later. Some people don't walk away because they're confused or overwhelmed or scared. They walk away because they've already chosen a different life, and all that's left is the right moment to disappear. Ethan Cole chose his moment carefully. He waited until our daughter was fighting for breath in the NICU, until I was too exhausted to think straight, too terrified to ask the right questions, too focused on the tiny rise and fall of our baby's chest to notice that my husband was already erasing himself from our life. 7 years later, when he saw me again, he didn't freeze because of me. He froze because of the woman standing just behind my shoulder, the one person he had spent all those years hoping would stay silent. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. If you had seen us a month before that hospital night, you would have thought we were one of those ordinary American couples trying to build something steady in a world that never stays still for long. I was 31 years old, living outside Columbus, Ohio, working as a billing coordinator for a regional medical supply company. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was stable, and at that stage of my life, stability meant more to me than glamour ever could. Ethan was 34, a project estimator for a commercial roofing company, the kind of man who always smelled faintly of coffee, printer paper, and the outside air. He had a calm voice, strong hands, and a way of speaking that made people trust him. That was one of the first things I loved about him. When Ethan looked at you, he made you feel like he had already decided you mattered. We had been married for 4 years by the time I got pregnant, and from the outside, our life looked decent. Not extravagant, not flashy, just respectable. A rented 2-story house with a cracked mailbox post, a used SUV with one stubborn window, Friday night takeout, church on holidays, and a baby on the way that I thought would make everything we had been working toward finally feel complete. But even before our daughter arrived, there were cracks. I kept naming something else. Ethan had started coming home later than usual. He'd leave his phone face down on the kitchen counter. He became more interested in money in a way that didn't match who I thought he was. He wasn't talking about bills or retirement or the cost of diapers. He was talking about what other men had. Bigger houses, better neighborhoods, wives who didn't stress over every dollar. He never said it harshly enough for me to call it cruelty. He said it with a little laugh, a shake of the head, a comment dropped into the room and left there for me to clean up emotionally by myself. At first I blamed the baby pressure. Then I blamed work. Then I blamed myself for being too sensitive. That's the trouble with betrayal when it arrives slowly. It teaches you to doubt your own ability to recognize it. The person who encouraged that doubt more than anyone was Ethan's mother, Diane Cole. Diane lived 20 minutes away in a tidy brick condo with white curtains, polished silver frames, and a way of speaking that could cut skin without raising her voice. She never openly insulted me, at least not in a way anyone else would call out, but she had a talent for making disapproval sound like concern. If I said I was tired, she'd ask if I was managing the pregnancy as well as other women do. If I talked about our finances, she'd remind me that Ethan had always been meant for bigger things. If Ethan missed dinner or forgot an appointment, she'd smile and tell me that a man with real pressure on his shoulders couldn't be expected to account for every little thing at home. Diane would say a man under pressure needs peace when he comes home, not more problems. Looking back, I can hear the message hidden inside every one of those remarks. Ethan was never the problem. Ethan was burdened. Ethan was misunderstood. Ethan was meant for more. And if our life together felt too small for him, then somehow that was a tragedy happening to Ethan, not something being done to me. At the time, I didn't understand how useful that kind of thinking could become for a man already halfway out the door. Our daughter, Lily, was due in mid-September. By the first week of that month, I was swollen, tired, and moving through each day like my body had become both precious and unreliable. Ethan had grown strangely attentive in short bursts. He'd ask if I needed anything, rub my shoulder for 30 seconds, kiss my forehead in the kitchen, then disappear emotionally just as quickly. It was enough to keep me hopeful, enough to make me think maybe the distance I felt was just fear about becoming a father. Men got scared, I told myself. People said that all the time. They said not to read too much into mood swings before a baby. They said the stress could make good marriages feel shaky for a while. What nobody tells you is that lies also like to hide inside ordinary explanations. The morning everything broke apart started warm and heavy. The kind of late summer Ohio morning where the air already feels used before the sun has fully come up. I woke at 5:47 and found Ethan standing in the bathroom doorway knotting his tie, staring at himself in the mirror with a look I couldn't read then and wish I had never learned to recognize later. It was the look of someone already gone in his mind. I asked him if he could come home early that evening because my back had been hurting more and I had a bad feeling I couldn't quite explain. He didn't look at me right away. Then he said he'd try. Not I will. Not of course. Just I'll try. It was such a small thing, but after he left, that phrase stayed with me. By 8:30, I was in the kitchen trying to force down half a piece of toast when I felt a sharp cramp that made me grip the edge of the counter. A few minutes later, I saw blood. For one suspended second, the whole house went silent around me. Then everything started moving too fast. I called Ethan once. No answer. I called again. Straight to voicemail. I called Diane because panic makes you practical before it makes you proud. She answered on the third ring, listened in chilled silence, then told me to stay calm and call an ambulance if I thought it was serious. If I thought it was serious. I hung up before I said something I would regret. Ethan finally called me back at 8:57. I remember the exact time because I looked at the microwave clock while trying not to cry. His voice sounded sharp, irritated even, until I told him I was bleeding. Then there was a pause. Not panic. Not fear. A pause. He said he was on his way. At the hospital, everything became fluorescent light, paperwork, clipped voices, the squeak of rubber saws, the cold edge of a bed rail against my hand. They moved quickly, faster than I expected, fast enough that my fear turned strange and distant, as if the terror belonged to some other woman I was watching from across the room. There were words like fetal distress, elevated pressure, emergency intervention. I signed forms I barely read. Somebody asked where my husband was, and I said he was coming. He arrived while a nurse was adjusting the monitors. He looked pale, but not the way I would later learn guilt can make a person pale. More like a man caught in bad timing. He kissed my forehead and took my hand, and for a little while I believed that whatever had been wrong between us had to wait. Our daughter came early and in trouble. Lily was born tiny, red-faced, furious for half a second, then frighteningly quiet. A team rushed her away before I got more than a glimpse. When they said NICU, the words barely registered. I just knew she wasn't in my arms. What I remember next is not one continuous memory, but pieces. The roughness of the blanket under my fingers. Ethan standing near the window with his phone in his hand. A nurse asking if there was a family member they should update. The ache in my body slowly turning into something mean and deep as the medication wore thin. Ethan said he needed to make a call. Then another. Then he said his mother was trying to come by, but traffic was bad. Then he was gone for 10 minutes. Then 20. Then back again, carrying coffee I never saw him buy. I asked if he'd seen Lily. He said only briefly, that she was small but strong, that the doctors were doing everything they could. When I asked if we could go together to the NICU as soon as they allowed it, he said yes, of course, absolutely. I can still hear how easy those words sounded in his mouth. Around dusk, a nurse wheeled me down to see my daughter. Lily lay inside clear plastic and hospital light, her skin almost translucent, one fist curled like she had arrived already defending herself from the world. I loved her with a force that made everything else disappear. For a little while, that love even made Ethan disappear. I wasn't thinking about his mood or our money or the late nights anymore. I was thinking only this: stay alive. Stay here. Stay mine. When I looked up, Ethan was standing a few steps back from the incubator, watching me instead of her. That should have told me something. I know that now. A new father can be scared of tubes and machines and monitors. But this wasn't fear. This was distance. Me and Lily were already becoming a separate unit in his mind, a life he was considering from the outside. He stayed long enough to be seen staying, long enough to answer a couple of texts, long enough to say he was going to run home and grab a few things for me, because we might be there longer than expected. I asked him to bring my charger, my robe, and the little knit blanket my sister had mailed from Indiana. He smiled and said he'd be back soon. He touched my shoulder with 2 fingers, as if contact itself required effort. Then he left. That was the last time I saw my husband as my husband. If you're still here with me in this story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps. And the next part of this story is where everything begins to come to light. At first, nothing seemed strange. People leave hospital rooms all the time. They get food, answer calls, shower, feed pets, tell family members what happened. I waited an hour and told myself traffic was bad. After 2 hours, I texted him. No response. I called. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Straight to voicemail. By midnight, the soft panic inside me had hardened into something colder. I called Diane. She answered more quickly this time, and before I could finish asking if Ethan was with her, she said, "I assumed he was there." The line went quiet for a second too long. Then she added, "I'm sure there's an explanation. People say that when they are trying to calm you down. They also say it when they already know more than they intend to tell you." A nurse found me crying beside Lily's incubator at 12:43 in the morning and asked if there was somebody she could call for me. I gave her my sister's number because by then, even in shock, I knew I needed someone who would arrive with answers instead of excuses. My sister, Rachel, drove through the night and got there just after 3 a.m. She walked into that NICU waiting area with no makeup, hair pulled back, sneakers unlaced, and the expression of a woman prepared to carry something heavy because the person she loved could not carry it alone. Rachel has never been dramatic. She is not one of those people who needs a crisis to become useful. She simply becomes useful. She got me water. She asked a nurse the questions I was too numb to form. She stood beside Lily's bed and whispered that this little girl had no idea how stubborn the women in her family were. Then, while I slept in ragged pieces for the first time in nearly 20 hours, Rachel went to my house to get my things. She came back just before noon with my charger, my robe, and a face that told me my life had changed again while I wasn't looking. She sat down slowly and placed a manila envelope on the hospital tray table. My name was written on the front in Ethan's handwriting. Inside were divorce papers, already prepared, already signed by him, and dated 11 days before Lily was born. Even now, if I close my eyes, I can feel the physical sensation of reading that date. It wasn't heartbreak at first. It was disorientation so complete it felt almost chemical. My mind kept rejecting what my eyes were seeing. 11 days before the birth, before the bleeding, before the emergency, before our daughter fought for air under hospital lights while I begged God not to take her. That was the moment I understood this hadn't been panic. It had been scheduling. Ethan had not cracked under pressure. He had arranged an exit and waited for life to hand him a moment messy enough to hide it in. Rachel found other things too. A half-empty closet. Ethan's watch case gone. The cash envelope we kept in the desk drawer gone. Our joint savings account reduced by nearly half. His laptop missing. 2 framed photos turned face down on the mantel, as if he couldn't bear to take them but couldn't stand to leave them looking at him either. There was no long note. No apology. Just a typed page clipped behind the legal papers stating that our marriage had become untenable, that he would be seeking a clean separation, and that future communication should be handled through counsel. Counsel. As if he were resigning from a board position rather than abandoning a wife recovering from childbirth and a newborn in intensive care. The worst part was not the cruelty. Cruelty at least acknowledges your existence. The worst part was the efficiency. Ethan had reduced me and Lily to a problem requiring administrative closure. If you've never had your life dismantled by somebody who still knows exactly where the cereal bowls go in your kitchen, then it's difficult to explain the particular humiliation of it. You keep expecting the human being to return, to break through the paperwork, to say this has gone too far, to show up at the hospital door looking wrecked and ashamed. But he didn't come. Not that day. Not the next. Not the day after that. What came instead were messages through a lawyer I had never heard of, requesting that I refrain from direct contact, requesting that any discussion regarding financial matters be documented, requesting patience while circumstances were clarified. Nobody would clarify what those circumstances actually were. Diane stopped answering my calls entirely. When Rachel called from her own phone, Diane picked up, listened, and said only that Ethan needed space and that I should focus on the baby. Focus on the baby. As if that weren't already the center of every waking second of my existence. Lily remained in the NICU for 12 days. They were the longest 12 days of my life, not only because I was terrified I might lose her, but because my grief had nowhere to go. I couldn't collapse. I couldn't scream. I couldn't even fully hate Ethan because I was too busy learning oxygen numbers, feeding schedules, discharge instructions, and how to place one careful finger in my daughter's palm without disturbing the wires taped to her skin. Rachel handled the phone calls. My mother flew in from Tulsa on day 3 and quietly took over every task that required a functioning adult brain. I signed forms. I pumped milk beside machines. I slept in 20-minute stretches. When people asked where Ethan was, I gave different versions of the truth depending on how much strength I had left. He's dealing with some things. He had an emergency. We're separated. By the end of that first week, I settled on the one answer that required the least performance. He's gone. People always looked shocked. I started to resent them for still having the luxury to be surprised. After Lily came home, life narrowed into survival. She was tiny, fragile, and beautiful in the way newborns become when you've already imagined losing them. Every bottle mattered. Every ounce gained felt like a verdict in our favor. I moved in with Rachel for a while because I could not face the house, not with Ethan's absence stored in every room like stale air. Rachel converted her home office into a nursery corner with a bassinet, stacked diapers along one wall, and never once made me feel like a burden. During those first months, I learned that exhaustion can become a kind of weather. You stop reacting to it and simply live inside it. At 2 a.m., while warming formula and listening to Lily's sharp little cries, I would think about Ethan in fragments. Was he sleeping through the night somewhere? Was he relieved? Had he told people some polished version of events in which leaving a wife and baby at the hospital was an unfortunate necessity rather than an act of moral failure? Sometimes anger kept me upright. Sometimes shame did. And sometimes it was something colder than both. The decision that my daughter would never be made to feel like the abandoned half of a story. The first real clue came from a charge on our old bank statement 2 months later. It was small enough most people would have missed it, a recurring payment to a private mailbox center on the north side of town. Rachel noticed it while sorting paperwork for my attorney. We traced it to a box rented 3 weeks before Lily was born. My attorney subpoenaed records tied to marital funds, and little by little the outline of Ethan's new life began to appear. There was a short-term lease on an apartment in Dublin. There were furniture purchases made before Lily's birth. There were restaurant charges in places Ethan had claimed he'd never been. And there was one name that surfaced more than once in call logs and account records: Vanessa Ward. Vanessa was a real estate broker Ethan had mentioned casually a handful of times over the previous year, always as somebody connected to a roofing bid or a commercial property discussion. She was 42, polished, well-connected, recently divorced, and known in the suburban circles around Columbus for hosting charity luncheons and moving into neighborhoods most people only drove through. When I saw her picture for the first time, smiling in a white dress beside a fundraiser banner, the shock wasn't that she was beautiful. It was that she looked exactly like the future Ethan had been hinting at whenever he made those comments about bigger lives and better neighborhoods. Still, affairs are almost too simple an explanation for the level of planning I was looking at. Vanessa might have been the incentive, but she was not the architect. That became clear when my attorney reviewed the divorce filings and pointed out that whoever had prepared Ethan's exit strategy knew exactly how to time pressure points, how to move money without triggering immediate alarms, how to frame a separation narrative before I'd even left the hospital. This was not a man improvising. This was a man being advised. The name attached to some of the early paperwork was not Ethan's lawyer, but a family law consultant who had once done contract work in Diane Cole's office. Diane had spent 20 years as an administrative manager for a mid-sized legal firm. She was not an attorney, but she knew how lawyers think, how documents move, how official language can make cruelty look orderly. For the first time, the shape of her role came into focus. She hadn't just defended Ethan after the fact. She had likely helped him prepare. When my attorney requested Diane's communication records related to marital assets, her counsel objected. Hard. That told us more than compliance ever could. Years passed the way difficult years do, slowly while you're in them. Then all at once when you look back, Lily grew stronger, louder, funnier. She had Ethan's dark eyes and my stubborn chin, a combination that felt unfair and perfect. By kindergarten, she loved space books, grilled cheese, and asking questions at the exact moment I was least emotionally equipped to answer them. Did my dad know me when I was a baby? Why doesn't Grandma Diane come see me? Do some dads get lost? Children do not ask in ways that allow adults to hide behind polished language. You either lie badly or tell the truth in pieces. I chose pieces. I told her father made choices that meant he could not be the kind of parent she deserved. I told her some adults care more about themselves than about the people who need them. I told her none of it was because of her. That last part one said often, not because Lily kept doubting it, but because I knew one day she might. Ethan remained mostly absent, though not entirely silent. Over the years, there were occasional attempts to adjust support. Indirect messages through attorneys, one birthday card when Lily turned 4 with no return address, and rumors passed through mutual acquaintances that his life with Vanessa had not gone the way he imagined. Apparently, wealth looks different when it expects obedience in return. They were seen together at country club events for a while, then less often. A former co-worker of Ethan's told Rachel that he'd left the roofing company after a dispute over commissions. Another said he was doing independent consulting and keeping a lower profile. I never went looking for updates. People brought them to me the way people always bring news they think will feel like justice. Mostly it didn't. Justice is not hearing that somebody who wrecked your life is mildly inconvenienced. Justice is quieter than that. It is building a life that no longer requires their collapse to validate your survival. By the 7th year, Lily was healthy, bright, and old enough to notice patterns adults wish children would miss forever. She had started 2nd grade that fall and had a habit of tilting her head when she asked hard questions, as if she were giving the truth one last chance to arrive cleanly before she reached for it herself. She no longer asked whether her father was coming back. That question had faded long before. What replaced it was more difficult. She wanted to understand why someone would choose distance over love, and there is no answer to that question that satisfies a child without breaking something inside her a little. So I learned to answer carefully. I told her that some people are not built for responsibility, even when they should be. I told her that love is proved in the staying. I told her that the people who matter most are the ones who show up when life gets hard, not the ones who make promises when life is easy. She seemed to understand more than I wanted her to. Children raised around silence become fluent in what isn't said. By then, my life had settled into something I once believed I'd never have again: steadiness. Not the naive kind I had before Ethan left, the kind built on assumptions and trust given too easily, but a steadier kind earned through repetition, work, and proof. Lily and I had moved into a modest 3-bedroom home on a quiet street lined with maples and uneven sidewalks. I had taken a promotion at work, then another. Rachel still lived close enough to stop by unannounced with groceries or sarcasm, depending on what she thought I needed more. My mother visited every spring and reorganized my pantry as if domestic order were a moral duty. There were school concerts, dentist appointments, field trip forms, fevers, lost library books, Saturday pancakes, and all the ordinary things that had once felt impossible to imagine when I was sitting beside a NICU incubator with divorce papers on a hospital tray table. If you had asked me then whether I still thought about Ethan every day, I would have said no and meant it. Pain changes shape when it can no longer control your schedule. It becomes background. It waits in drawers, in old emails, in the way your body still tightens when an unknown number calls too late at night. But it no longer decides who you are. Then, in late October, a certified letter arrived with a law firm's return address I did not recognize. It came on a Thursday, just after dinner, while Lily was at the kitchen table coloring a solar system for science class. I opened it standing by the sink, expecting some mistake tied to insurance or taxes. Instead, it was a petition. Ethan was requesting a formal review of custody and visitation rights. 7 years after vanishing from the hospital. 7 years after leaving our daughter in critical care, draining our savings, and reducing marriage to a typed procedural exit. 7 years of absence, interrupted only by attorney language and one birthday card so generic it could have been sent to any child in America. I read the first page twice, not because I didn't understand it, but because my mind refused to let the words settle into meaning. He wasn't apologizing. He wasn't reaching out in shame. He wasn't asking whether Lily wanted to know him. He was petitioning, requesting standing, framing his return as a lawful correction rather than a moral outrage. And on the third page, tucked inside the legal phrasing, was the sentence that explained everything. A recent inheritance had stabilized his circumstances and enhanced his capacity to provide a suitable environment for the minor child. Ethan hadn't come back because he had found his conscience. He had come back because money had changed hands, and he believed money could rewrite the record. My attorney, a patient woman named Colleen Mercer who had represented me since Lily was an infant, read the petition the next morning, and leaned back in her chair with the expression of someone too experienced to be surprised and still offended on principle. She told me not to panic. She told me his case was weak. She told me judges rarely look kindly on abandonment followed by sudden parental interest tied to financial improvement. Then she paused and said the one thing that tightened everything in my chest again. But if he's filing now, he either thinks he has leverage or somebody has convinced him he does. That somebody turned out to be Vanessa. Not directly at first, but through a series of attached financial disclosures and property statements that showed Ethan had been living for the past 2 years in a guest house on an estate technically owned by a trust managed in part by Vanessa Ward's firm. She had not married him, as gossip had once predicted. She had not built the elegant second life he seemed to think he deserved. She had, however, remained connected to him in the way ambitious people sometimes keep damaged men nearby when they are still useful. According to the filings, Ethan had recently been named beneficiary of a business settlement tied to a commercial dispute Vanessa's company had resolved out of court. It was enough money to dress up his circumstances and enough confidence to make him reckless. The petition was not about fatherhood. It was about image, access, and the delusion that enough time had passed for him to re-enter our lives as something other than what he was. The hearing was scheduled for December. Until then, Colleen advised silence, documentation, and routine. Maintain stability. Don't react publicly. Don't let Lily overhear things she can't carry. I followed all of it, at least outwardly. Inwardly, I was reliving rooms I had spent years teaching myself to leave behind. The hospital hallway. The empty chair. The typed page clipped behind divorce papers. I hated how easily the body remembers what the mind has worked so hard to file away. One evening, after Lily had gone to bed, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table with an old banker's box full of records I had not opened in years. Statements, court notices, printed emails, photographs, notes from my attorney, a copy of the divorce filing. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I think I simply needed proof that I had not exaggerated what happened, that the scale of the betrayal had been as real as it felt. That was when I found a document I had almost forgotten. A deposition notice from years earlier that Diane's attorney had successfully delayed and then narrowed until it became practically useless. Attached to it was a memo from Colleen, written during the divorce, warning that Diane appeared to have had knowledge prior to separation actions, but had refused to answer questions beyond procedural denials. I stared at that phrase for a long time. Knowledge prior to separation actions. It had always been there, sitting in plain language, never resolved because life had demanded I move on before I got the full truth. 3 days later, Diane called me for the first time in almost 6 years. I nearly let it ring out when her name appeared, but something made me answer. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she asked if I was alone. Her voice sounded older, thinner, less certain than I remembered. I said yes, though Rachel was in the next room helping Lily with spelling words. Diane exhaled slowly and said she had heard about the petition. I told her that was hardly surprising, since people like Ethan do not suddenly discover legal ambition without encouragement from somewhere familiar. She didn't take the bait. She just said, he should never have filed it. There are sentences that change the temperature of a room, even over the phone. That was one of them. I asked her what exactly she meant by that, and for a few seconds I heard nothing except the faint scrape of movement, as if she were sitting down. Then she said the words I had once wanted so desperately, and now almost didn't trust myself to hear. There are things you were never told. If she had said them 7 years earlier, I might have begged for details. At 40 now, with a child sleeping under my roof and a hearing looming over us, I felt something colder than need. I felt focus. We met in the back room of a coffee shop off Route 33 2 evenings later. Diane looked smaller than I remembered, though people don't really shrink that quickly. What changes is the authority they once carried in your imagination. Without it, they seem more human and far less protected. She wore a gray coat, a pearl necklace, and the expression of a woman who had rehearsed an explanation only to discover that explanations decay in the presence of truth. She didn't begin with an apology. People like Diane rarely do. They begin with context, as if motive reduces damage. She told me that in the months before Lily was born, Ethan had become convinced he was trapped. He believed fatherhood would lock him into a life he didn't want. Vanessa had been feeding him fantasies about reinvention, about starting over with the right person, the right network, the right opportunities. Diane said she initially thought it was midlife panic arriving early, that he would calm down once the baby came. Instead, he asked for help. Not emotional help. Practical help. He wanted to know how to separate finances cleanly, how to document dissatisfaction, how to establish a legal position before the birth complicated everything. Diane said she told herself she was only protecting her son from making impulsive mistakes. But then she admitted the part that mattered. She had reviewed paperwork, introduced him to the consultant, and advised him to avoid confrontations that could become messy after delivery. Messy. That was the word she used while I sat there trying not to imagine my labor reduced to a scheduling inconvenience. I asked if she knew he intended to leave that exact day. She said no, not with certainty. I asked if she knew he had taken money in advance. She looked down at her cup and said she knew he was moving funds to prepare. I asked whether she knew about Vanessa. She said yes. I asked whether she had ever once, in all those years, thought about what it meant for Lily to grow up without the father who abandoned her. Her face changed then, not enough to redeem her, but enough to show that some part of her had finally caught up to the damage. She told me she had tried, once, after the first year, to convince Ethan to relinquish any future claim quietly and permanently. He refused. Vanessa had insisted it might be useful one day to preserve certain rights. Useful. That word landed harder than I expected. It was proof of what I had long suspected. Our daughter had never been a person in their calculations. She had been a variable, a future point of leverage, a sympathetic detail to be managed when convenient. Diane reached into her bag and slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of emails, old text printouts, and a scanned letter Ethan had sent her 3 weeks before Lily was born. The letter was short and cold. He wrote that he had one window to do this cleanly, that the hospital phase would create enough confusion, and that after the birth, emotions would make leaving more difficult. He was writing about the destruction of our family the way a contractor writes about weather conditions before a demolition. I did not cry in that coffee shop. Grief had long since burned through into something more durable than tears. What I felt was confirmation, and with confirmation came a calm, so complete it frightened even me. I asked Diane why she was telling me now. She answered with more honesty than I expected. Vanessa had cut Ethan off financially after a dispute over a failed property deal. Ethan had become unstable, angry, and insistent that Lily represented an unclaimed part of his life he could still recover. Worse, he had started blaming Diane for everything. Blaming her for helping. Blaming her for not helping enough. Blaming her for the fact that the future Vanessa once hinted at had never become real. In other words, the same son she had once protected had turned on her the moment protection no longer served him. But there was another reason too, one she almost whispered. A few months earlier, Diane had attended one of Lily's school choir performances without telling anyone. She had sat in the back and watched her granddaughter sing. She looked so much like him, Diane said, and absolutely nothing like the life he chose. That may not sound like remorse, but sometimes remorse begins when fantasy loses a direct contest with reality. She had seen the child he treated as leverage and realized she was a whole person. 7 years late, but real. Colleen nearly smiled when I handed her the folder the next morning. Not because the contents were amusing, but because lawyers recognize decisive evidence the way surgeons recognize a pulse. The emails established planning. The text messages showed Diane cautioning Ethan to wait until the hospital phase settles the narrative. A line so chilling in its blandness it almost read like parody. The letter from Ethan was worse. Colleen said it transformed a morally ugly story into a legally devastating one. When Diane agreed, through counsel, to appear voluntarily at the hearing and authenticate the materials, the ground under Ethan's petition began to shift. He still showed up confident. According to the pre-hearing filings, still pressed for expanded visitation, still characterized his absence as a period of personal instability exacerbated by manipulation from third parties. That last phrase told me he was already preparing to blame everyone except himself. It was almost funny in a dead, distant way. Men like Ethan spend years mistaking deflection for strategy, then act shocked when the truth arrives with timestamps. The hearing took place on a Friday morning under low winter light, in one of those county buildings designed to drain grandeur from conflict and reduce everything to fluorescent procedure. I arrived with Colleen. Rachel came too, because some moments belong not just to justice, but to witnesses. Ethan was already there in the hallway outside the courtroom, wearing an expensive coat that fit him a little too perfectly, like it had been chosen to make an argument before he even opened his mouth. He looked older, of course. The lines at the corners of his eyes were deeper, and the confidence he wore on his face had the polished strain of something rehearsed. For one suspended second, seeing him again dragged the air from my lungs. Not because I missed him, not because I feared him, because my body recognized the person attached to the worst day of my life before my mind had time to remember that he no longer held any power over me. He looked at me the way people look at places they once left in a hurry, as if checking whether the damage remained. Then his expression settled into something smug and almost relieved. He thought I had come alone in the way that mattered. Then Diane stepped out from the far side of the hallway and moved to stand just behind my shoulder. I will remember Ethan's face for the rest of my life, not because it was dramatic, but because it was so nakedly human for the first time. His entire posture changed before he said a word. The certainty left him first, then the color, then the small, practiced superiority he had carried into the building like a second tie. He stared at his mother, then at the folder in Colleen's hands, then back at Diane, as if willing her to revert into the woman who had spent years turning his selfishness into something manageable. She didn't. She just looked at him with a tiredness so complete it seemed to come from somewhere deeper than age. It was the look of a woman who had finally run out of excuses for the son she had spent most of his life protecting from consequences. Ethan opened his mouth once, then closed it again. He glanced at me as if I might somehow step in and rescue him from what was happening, as if the person he left in a hospital room with stitches, fear, and a child in intensive care might still be willing to absorb one more mess for him. I didn't move. Colleen said his name in the calm, measured tone attorneys use when they already know the ground has shifted. Diane took another step forward and said the first completely honest sentence I had ever heard her say in my presence. "Tell them what you planned." Ethan gave a short laugh, the kind people use when reality becomes too dangerous to admit. He said she was confused, emotional, manipulated, and for a second I could almost see the old machinery starting up, the old instinct to talk over facts until everyone got tired enough to accept a softer version. But the problem with documents is that they do not get tired, and the problem with timestamps is that they do not care how charming you once were. Inside the courtroom, the air felt stale and overused, as if too many families had broken open there for the walls to hold anything fresh. The judge was a woman in her 60s with silver hair, rimless glasses, and the expression of someone who had heard every possible variation of, "It's more complicated than it looks," and stopped being impressed by complexity years ago. Ethan's attorney tried first to present the clean version. A period of instability, regret, maturity, renewed desire to reconnect, greater financial capacity. The language was careful, sympathetic, almost respectable. If I had not lived through the truth, I might have admired how efficiently pain had been repackaged into legal reasonableness. Colleen let the story settle just long enough to become comfortable. Then she began pulling threads. She introduced the old filings, the withdrawal records, the predated divorce documents, the mailbox rental, the lease signed before Lily was born, Diane's texts, Diane's emails, and finally, the scan letter Ethan wrote before the delivery, the one where he described the hospital as a window and the birth as a point of confusion that would help him leave cleanly. There are moments when a room does not erupt, does not gasp, does not become theatrical, but simply changes shape around the truth. That was one of them. Even Ethan's attorney went still. Diane testified more quietly than I expected. No dramatic confession, no shaking voice, no tears designed to earn forgiveness she had not earned. She spoke like a woman reading out the inventory from a fire after the house was already gone. She confirmed that Ethan had come to her weeks before Lily was born asking how to separate finances without creating unnecessary conflict. She confirmed that she connected him with a consultant she knew through her old legal office. She confirmed that he had already begun moving money before the hospital emergency. When Colleen asked whether Ethan had discussed timing his exit around the delivery, Diane hesitated only once, and that hesitation told the truth before her words did. Then she said yes. He believed the birth would create enough confusion to keep me from reacting quickly. He believed that by the time I understood what had happened, he would be settled elsewhere. He believed that if he waited until after the baby arrived, I would be too emotionally exhausted to fight effectively. Diane's voice thinned when she said the next part. He wanted it done cleanly. Those were his words. Cleanly. There it was again, that same sterile word men use when they want cruelty to sound like organization. Ethan denied everything with the kind of confidence that only survives a few minutes after exposure. He said the letter was taken out of context. He said his mother had grown bitter and unstable. He said Vanessa had pressured him, that he had been manipulated, that he regretted the way he left but had been in a mental fog no one understood at the time. He tried to recast himself as a man who made poor choices under pressure rather than a man who planned an exit around his daughter's medical crisis. If you listened without details, he sounded almost plausible. That was always Ethan's gift. He didn't tell outrageous lies. He told tidy ones, the kind shaped to fit inside what other people were willing to believe. But one by one, the details ruined him. The judge asked why the divorce papers were dated 11 days before Lily's birth. He claimed an administrative error. She asked why he had transferred funds into a separate account before the emergency. He said he was trying to protect himself financially during marital instability. She asked why there was a lease signed before his daughter was born and before any formal separation discussion had occurred. He said he was exploring options. Then Colleen read from his own letter, slowly, every word landing exactly where it should. I have one window to do this cleanly. The hospital phase will create enough confusion. Ethan looked down. For the first time, he did not try to interrupt. There are moments in life when justice does not feel triumphant. It feels procedural. It arrives in a measured tone, in page numbers, in a judge folding her glasses and explaining that the court does not reward abandonment dressed up as delayed parental concern. She said Ethan's petition for custody and expanded visitation was denied in full. She said his 7-year absence, the timing of his departure, the documentary evidence of planning, and his failure to demonstrate good faith made his request legally and morally indefensible. She ordered that any future attempt at contact would require a separate, supervised review process initiated only after long-term compliance with support obligations, counseling, and documented accountability. Then she paused and added something I will remember for the rest of my life. She said, "A child is not a chapter you may reopen when it becomes convenient." The sentence landed so hard inside me that for a second I couldn't breathe. Not because it was poetic, because it was exact. That had always been his mistake. Ethan believed time could soften facts. He believed absence could be edited into regret. He believed that if enough years passed, he could return to the story and write himself back in as a changed man. But children are not story devices, and mothers do not forget the day someone left them holding a life alone. After the hearing, Ethan tried once more in the hallway. He asked if he could speak to me privately, as if privacy had ever improved his honesty. I told him no. He said he had loved Lily in his own way. I looked at him and realized something surprising. I no longer needed him to hurt for what he had done. I no longer needed apology, confession, or collapse. Time had done something better than revenge. It had removed his authority from my memory. Your own way, I said, was leaving. He flinched, but not enough to matter. Then he turned to Diane. I expected anger. I expected accusation. What came instead was something weaker and uglier. He looked at her like a disappointed customer whose service had finally failed. You chose her over your family, he said. Diane answered with more truth than she had ever offered either of us in all the years I had known her. No, she said. I chose a child over a lie. Ethan stared at her for a second, then walked away with the stiff, brittle posture of a man still trying to preserve dignity in front of witnesses who had already seen too much. Diane did not ask for forgiveness after that. To her credit, she seemed to understand that forgiveness is not a receipt handed out when someone finally tells the truth they should have told years earlier. What she asked for was smaller and, in some ways, harder. She asked whether one day Lily might be allowed to know that not every member of her father's family had remained silent forever. I didn't answer right away. People love stories where truth fixes everything in a single scene. Real life is harsher and slower than that. Truth does not restore lost birthdays. It does not put a father beside a NICU bed 7 years too late. It does not give a little girl the easy version of family other children take for granted. It only does one thing reliably. It stops the lie from running the room. So I told Diane that if she wanted any place near Lily's future, she would have to earn it through consistency, humility, and the understanding that access was not her right. It was mine to protect and Lily's to decide. Diane nodded as if she had expected nothing else. For the first time, I believed she might actually mean it. The hardest part came later, not in the courthouse, but at home that evening when Lily asked why I looked tired and Rachel, for once, had no joke ready. Children sense weather changes in a house long before adults name them. I sat with Lily on the couch under the blue blanket she always dragged from room to room in winter and told her that there had been a hearing about her father. I told her the judge had made a decision to keep her safe and keep things the way they had been. She listened without interrupting, tracing a finger along the seam of the blanket. Then she asked the question I had feared and expected all at once. Did he want me back because he loves me now? There are truths you can simplify, and truths you must carry carefully because they can cut the wrong place if handled badly. I told her he came back for reasons that had more to do with himself than with her. I told her that grown-ups sometimes confuse wanting something with loving it. I told her love is not measured by whether a person returns when it suits them. Love is measured by who stayed, who protected, who showed up every single day, even when no one was watching. She was quiet for a long moment after that. Then she leaned into me and said, "So you won." I held her tighter and said the only answer that mattered. We did. In the weeks that followed, something subtle but important changed inside me. For years, part of my pain had come from the gap between what happened and what was acknowledged. People knew Ethan left. Some suspected an affair. A few guessed Diane had helped more than she admitted. But the full architecture of the betrayal had lived mostly inside records, fragments, and my own body's memory. Now it had been spoken aloud in a room where it mattered. Now it existed beyond me. The truth had witnesses. That changes a person. It does not erase the damage, but it returns language to places shame once occupied. I found myself sleeping better. I stopped checking the locks twice before bed. I stopped imagining future ambushes through legal envelopes and procedural games. The threat had always depended on fog. Once the fog lifted, Ethan looked smaller than the fear he had cast. A month later, just before Christmas, a plain envelope arrived with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note from Diane and a photograph I had never seen. The note was brief. She wrote that she had found the picture tucked inside an old album and thought it belonged with Lily if I decided, someday, that Lily should have it. The photograph showed Ethan in a hospital chair, taken just hours before he disappeared. He was staring through the NICU glass at our daughter, and on his face was something I had not expected to see preserved anywhere: uncertainty. Not love exactly, and not tenderness pure enough to redeem him, but conflict. Proof that he had known, at least for one fleeting moment, what he was abandoning. I stared at that picture longer than I cared to admit. For years I had told myself he left because I was not enough, because our life was not grand enough, because our love was too ordinary to compete with whatever fantasy Vanessa offered him. But that photograph suggested a harder truth. He left knowing exactly what he was doing. He saw his daughter. He saw the life in front of him. And he chose himself anyway. Strange as it sounds, that knowledge freed me more than any softened version ever could. There is peace in finally stopping the negotiation with the past. He did not fail by accident. He chose. And once you know that, you stop searching memory for excuses that were never there. As for Vanessa, her name faded the way names like hers often do when attention moves on and convenience expires. I heard through Rachel, who heard through someone else, that her firm restructured after a series of disputes, and that she sold the estate where Ethan had been staying. Whether she ever loved him or merely found him useful no longer interested me. Some people enter a story as a great temptation and leave it as a footnote. That was Vanessa. The more important truth was simpler. She had not taken Ethan from a happy home. She had offered him a mirror in which selfishness looked sophisticated. He recognized himself and stepped toward it. That was all. Spring came early the next year. Lily turned 8, lost her front tooth at school, and insisted on a science-themed birthday cake that looked nothing like a planet but made her proud anyway. Rachel burned the hot dogs at the cookout and blamed the grill. My mother cried during the birthday song as if she had not spent the whole week bossing everyone around with military precision. I watched Lily run across the yard with frosting on her cheek and sunlight in her hair, and for the first time in a long time I thought about the hospital without feeling pulled back into it. That place had once seemed like the site of an ending. In some ways it was. My marriage ended there. Illusion ended there. Dependence ended there. But another life began too, one I had been too devastated to recognize at the time. The life where I learned what I could survive. The life where my daughter grew up loved, protected, and free from the man who had mistaken fatherhood for a burden instead of a privilege. The life where truth arrived late, but still arrived. People talk about karma as if it always comes with spectacle, with ruin dramatic enough to satisfy everyone watching from the outside. But real justice rarely looks cinematic when it finally settles. Sometimes it looks like a petition denied in a plain courtroom. Sometimes it looks like an aging mother admitting she helped destroy something she can never rebuild. Sometimes it looks like a little girl sleeping peacefully in the next room because the law, for once, did what the law is supposed to do. And sometimes it looks like this. A woman once left bleeding, frightened, and alone in a hospital learning that she no longer needs the man who abandoned her to suffer in order for her life to be whole. If there is one thing this story taught me, it is that betrayal does not only reveal the person who leaves. It reveals the people who stay silent, the people who make excuses, the people who confuse loyalty with protection, and the people who decide far too late that truth matters after all. But it also reveals something else, something far more useful. It reveals what remains when the performance ends. Ethan built his choices around convenience, status, and escape. I built mine around a child, a home, and the simple discipline of showing up. 7 years later, when he saw who was standing behind me, he froze because he understood at last that the version of the story he had been living on was over. The silence had ended. The lie had lost its shelter. And he was finally standing where I had stood all those years ago, in a place with nowhere left to go except through the truth. So if you ever wonder whether justice was served, I think the better question is this. What would justice even look like in a story like this? Would it be Ethan losing money? Losing reputation? Losing the polished future he once chased so hard he abandoned his own child to pursue it? Maybe part of it. But for me, justice was never really about watching him fall. It was about making sure Lily never had to. It was about making sure the worst decision one man ever made did not become the shape of her life. It was about teaching her, by example more than speech, that love is a matter of endurance, not performance. And in the end, that may be the only victory that lasts. If you've stayed with this story until the end, like the video and subscribe to the channel. More real stories of betrayal, truth, and justice are coming next. Tell me honestly, if someone walked away from their child at the worst possible moment and came back years later asking for another chance, would you believe they deserved one?